The Vanishing Neighbor. In the quiet, unremarkable town of Hartsville, the residents had long enjoyed a sense of normalcy. That was until the day Stephen Thompson vanished. Stephen had been the kind of neighbor you barely noticed, polite, quiet, and solitary. His sudden disappearance was unsettling enough, but what made it truly horrifying was the fact that James, the protagonist, could still see him. It started on an overcast Tuesday. James had just returned home from work, the sky heavy with impending rain. As he approached his front door, he noticed something odd. Stephen's house, once meticulously maintained, looked abandoned. The lawn was unkempt, and a curtain in the living room window was partially drawn, swaying slightly in the breeze. James frowned. Stephen had never been one to let things go. Curious, he went to check on his neighbor, but the door was locked tight. He knocked, calling out, but there was no response. Shrugging it off as a temporary inconvenience, James left a note on the door, suggesting they catch up later. The next morning, James woke up to an eerie silence. It was unusual for Stephen's house, which was always bustling with a low hum of everyday life. Still, James convinced himself it was nothing. Maybe Stephen had gone on a spontaneous vacation. But when days turned into a week without any sign of Stephen, James began to worry. He decided to visit the house again, this time more determined. As he approached, he noticed something strange. Through the crack in the curtain, he could see Stephen inside. He was standing perfectly still, facing the wall. James's heart raced. Was Stephen okay? Was he in trouble? "Stephen!" James shouted through the door. "Are you in there?" "It's James, your neighbor." The figure did not move. James pounded on the door, desperation growing. Still no response. Panicked, he called the police. When they arrived, they forced the door open and found the house in pristine condition, just as it had always been. There were no signs of struggle, no clues as to Stephen's whereabouts. It was as if he had simply vanished. James's concerns grew when the police found nothing. The case was closed, with no evidence of foul play or even a sign that Stephen had ever been in the house recently. He felt a gnawing anxiety that wouldn't let go. As days passed, James continued to see Stephen. The figure remained motionless in the house, always in the same position, as if trapped in an eternal standstill. James tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. He even asked the neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual, but everyone shrugged it off. One evening, driven by mounting frustration, James decided to break into Stephen's house. He picked the lock and entered, determined to find answers. The interior was immaculate, as though frozen in time. The furniture was covered in dust covers, and every object was precisely where it should be. But Stephen was nowhere to be found. James made his way to the living room, where he spotted a peculiar object on the mantel, a small, ornate mirror framed in dark wood. It was out of place, and its surface was covered in a thin layer of dust. Intrigued, he wiped the dust away and gazed into the mirror. The reflection was not what he expected. The mirror showed Stephen standing perfectly still, just as he had seen through the curtain, but the image was distorted, as though it were underwater. Stephen's eyes in the reflection were hollow and dark, and his expression was one of deep sorrow. Suddenly, the image in the mirror began to move. Stephen's head slowly turned towards James, his eyes locking onto him with a look of profound despair. James stumbled back, his heart pounding in terror. The reflection's mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was as though Stephen was trying to scream, but the words were trapped. James's breath quickened. He looked away from the mirror, but the haunting image of Stephen's desperate eyes was burned into his mind. As he turned to leave, he noticed something else, written in faint, almost imperceptible handwriting on the mirror's frame were the words, "You can see me, but you cannot save me." James's blood ran cold. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. Stephen was trapped, and somehow the mirror was the conduit. He knew he had to act fast. If Stephen was in some sort of liminal state, he needed to find a way to help him before it was too late. Desperate for answers, James researched the mirror and found disturbing accounts of similar phenomena. According to ancient folklore, mirrors were believed to be portals between worlds, and those who vanished in such a way were often trapped between dimensions, visible but unreachable. In a final, desperate act, James performed a ritual he found in his research, hoping to free Stephen from his torment. The ritual required a series of specific incantations and the placement of certain objects around the mirror. As James worked, he felt a cold, malevolent presence growing stronger, almost as if the mirror itself was resisting his efforts. The air grew colder, and shadows seemed to dance around the room. The reflection of Stephen became more frantic, his movements erratic, as if he were struggling against invisible chains. The whispers began, a chorus of faint, sorrowful voices filling the room. With a final incantation, the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. Stephen's reflection began to fade, the sorrowful expression replaced with an eerie calm. James watched, breathless, as the image slowly disappeared. When the mirror finally cleared, Stephen was gone. The room returned to its silent, dust-covered state. James felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. Stephen was free, but at what cost? James never saw Stephen again. The mirror remained a silent witness to the ordeal, its surface now blank and ordinary. The Hastings Library went back to its peaceful state, but James knew the darkness that lurked behind the everyday veneer. He often wondered if the mirror had been a portal, or if Stephen was now a shadow in some other place, forever lost. The mirror was eventually removed, but the story of Stephen Thompson and the haunted mirror became a local legend. No one could explain the mystery, and the house eventually fell into disrepair, left as a reminder of the inexplicable and the terrifying. And James, now a changed man, never forgot the dark eyes of his vanishing neighbor, forever watching from the other side.